What I'm about to tell you is gonna shock you. There are people who duct tape their kettlebell into methamphetamine. And there are other people who use the kettlebell to crack the skull of their spouse in an attempted murder. Now, isn't that crazy? And that's the reason why I'm gonna show you the top 10 ways to use the kettlebell as efficiently and as effectively as possible. Grüß miteinander, Gregory from Lebe here. Now, isn't this a crazy story? Folks duct taping their kettlebell into drugs, and then other folks trying to kill their wife or their husband with the kettlebell by slamming it on their head. Now this is crazy stuff, and this is apparently the world that we live in that is sometimes really spooky and crazy. Now let's dive into the 10 exercises. I'm gonna show it to you. Now, first of all, I'm gonna show you the exercise, what it's like, and then I'm gonna show you the beginner mistakes that most people do because we specialize in helping beginners find their way with kettlebells. And don't forget, guys, if this is your first time here, we're all about kettlebells. We do live workouts, we do regular kettlebell content as well as podcasts. Now, if you want to dig deep into kettlebells and you want to find the ins and outs, then like the video and consider subscribing. Now, these 10 ways are actually 10 exercises. I just used the title to make friends with the YouTube algorithm. Now, the first exercise is the row. Now, what is the row for? The row is for your lats. Now, very interesting to note, when you do kettlebell training, you almost train your whole body with every exercise, almost. So it's not only the lats, because when you are in this hinge ready position and you lean forward, you also feel some tension in your hamstrings and in your glutes. And standing here means that you also will work some part of your lower back. So it's not only the lats, but let's take a look at what the exercise is like. Now, you place the kettlebell right in front of you and make sure you stand shoulder width apart and that the kettlebell is approximately in the middle of your foot. Now you go down. Now hinge. How do I go down? Don't lean down like this. You hinge. Then you grab the kettlebell like this. I have a straight back. I grab the kettlebell. I make sure that my shoulder is really tight and compact. And then I pull the kettlebell up. Down. Down. And then switching sides, of course. Down. Down. As you can see, I breathe out when I'm on top. And sometimes I even breathe out when I'm at the bottom. Because when you have an intense workout where you use the row, then sometimes you maybe need 2 breaths to catch your breath. Now, what you can also do is when you feel your lower back getting a little bit tight, is you don't have to lean forward as much, so you can just pull it up a little bit higher. Now it's higher up, and then you can row, because that angle will allow it for your lower back to maybe not feel as tight as when you go down a little more. But the difference is that when you have the kettlebell up in here, that it's still in the air, which gives you some additional benefits and makes it maybe, in that case, a little harder. Now, the one mistake that most beginners make is they hunch when they're in that so-called hinge ready phase, or when they're in the hinge. Now you have 3 movable parts of your spine. This is first of all, the lower back, the lumbar part, then the middle part. This is the thoracic part, and then the neck. So these are the 3 areas of your spine that you can actually move. So make sure that you stick your butt out, chest up, and the neck is in line with your back, and then you have a straight back. The second mistake that beginners make with the row is they sometimes bring the weight up, not in a straight fashion, but they do something like this, where they start additionally curling the weight, and then they feel it more in their arms than in their back. Exercise number 2 is the deadlift. But before we want to dive into the deadlift, I want to show you this little helpful tool. This stick can give you a great feedback to really understand what a straight back feels like. So what you want to do is you want to put that stick right behind you on those 3 movable parts in your spine that we just talked about: lumbar part, thoracic, and cervical. So we have neck, chest, and glutes. Now, if you go down, you want to make sure when you hinge, because hinging means you start the movement in your hips and not in your knees. When you start to hinge, You feel the tension in your glutes and in your hamstrings. And what this does is you want to make sure that you don't lose connection to any of the three parts that have to stay connected, right? This gives you that great feeling of what a straight back really supposed to feel like. Now let's take a look at the deadlift, what the deadlift is all about. It's actually an easier version when you do with the kettlebell. Now, it's the same thing as with the row. We want to stand shoulder width apart on the kettlebell. Over the kettlebell, it rests in the middle portion of my foot. Same thing. Now I'm start to hinge. Upper body leans forward. I make sure I got it straight back. Now I have to straighten my arms. And now I gotta go deeper. So in order for me to go deeper, I don't have to lean over. What I can do is just flex my knees a little bit. So bend them a little bit, duck, and that's it. So now I'm ready, you see? You don't have to lean forward. You can just start flexing the knee joint a little bit, and here you go. Now you want to make sure you pull your shoulders back so you got a tight back, it's compact. Now when you come up, you want to, from that stretch that you have in the posterior chain of your legs, you want to extend. Boom. Now I'm contracting glutes and hamstrings. Now I'm standing upright, and that's it. Shoulders are back. You don't have to be all over like this and hyper extend the spine. You can just be right here. It's the most important thing to have that contraction in the glutes. And when you go down, it's the hip initiates the movement, the upper body reacts, and at the end, I'm bending my knees just a little bit. It's very important for you to understand that your knees have to be loose, not bent, because when you have your knees loose and your hip is back, this means you have optimal stretching, that stretch reflex in your hands and your glutes, and this will help you to produce force to bring the weight in that position, lockout position on top. Now most beginners make the mistake, the same with the row, is they lean forward and they hunch their back. Now the problem is if I start lifting like this can cause some problem with my spine. And the second mistake that beginners make is even if they have a straight back, they come up and then they think they have to pull the kettlebell additionally up. You don't have to. Your arms are like hooks, okay? You straighten them, you make sure that your shoulder is tight in the socket, and then you don't have to bend your arms, they stay extended. So that's it with the deadlift. The deadlift allows you to move a lot of weight, but you always have to make sure that your back is straight. That's a rhyme, that's great. Another rhyme, wow! Exercise number 3, we actually move up the ladder. You see there is some form of programming already involved. We are now taking a look at the lunge. Now the lunge can be a little tricky because you actually isolate the leg. Now, what does the lunge look like? We could actually, if we are very technically incorrect, we would call it the so-called goblet reverse lunge, but you can just call it a lunge. It's just us coaches, we always like to make it very technical. So we got it up here. What we do is reverse means I step back on my toes, and then I put the whole weight down. I want to make sure I have a 90-degree angle in my knees as well as in my hips. And then what I love to do is I come back up. Now I'm stable again. Now I'm stepping back into my starting position. Same thing with the other leg. You go on your toes, then you bring your whole weight down, boom, and then you bring the whole weight up, and then you go back into the starting position. From the front, always make sure I stand in a more diagonal space, not in a straight line. This can cause a little bit of a balance problem. So make sure, stepping down, chest is up, coming back, boom, and that is the lunge, or the goblet reverse lunge to be exact. Now beginners may make the mistake that, first of all, like I've already mentioned, they go back in a straight line, use more of a diagonal approach. The second mistake that they do is they go back and then they immediately drop down. I always like to imagine that first of all I need stability. Okay, now I'm safe, now I'm going down. And with the range of motion, if your legs don't allow to go fully down or you have a problem getting up, then you're just halfway, that's totally fine. The third mistake that beginners make is when they're in the down position, sometimes, maybe if you don't step back with enough space, if something like this happens, then you probably have more torque in your knees because there's not enough space, and maybe you land on your feet, on your toes now, and now you think, okay, now I gotta stand up on your toes. And you always want to make sure if you stand straight, you have that triagonal, what is that? The triagonal that the god of this, the god of the oceans, with that triangle, all right? That triangle space that you put down, so that means it's toes and then it's heels. You have to have full contact. So always make sure there is enough space. Now, beginner mistake number 4, if you step too wide, this can actually cause a pretty tight stretch on your hips. And then beginner mistake number 5 is you step back and then you come up and then you hunch because it's getting tough on your back. You have to stand straight and get up. Don't lean forward and stand up like in a stride like you would when you're sprinting. You want to stand up straight, coming back up, boom, and that's it. Now, beginner mistake, the final one that I always see with people who are just starting out is you're in the top position. Okay, you're coming up, it's pretty fine, and now you're shaking a little bit because your leg is isolated. Now you see there's so much force that you have to produce if you do it the first time. You know, maybe you come up straight and then you pull your knees in and then you stand up with a hunched back. This may happen. So what I want to advise you is to just start the reverse lunge, maybe without any weights, get the feeling, get the vibe, and then once you have the stabilizing process really down pat, you can maybe go a little faster, and always make sure that you stand up straight. Number 4 is the goblet squat. Now, the goblet squat can be very tricky if you have some tight hips. And I see even many coaches do it the wrong way because you have to understand the biomechanics. If you have a goblet squat, which looks like this, down, back up, down, back up. Then, what happens is the weight is in front of you, right? If the weight is in front of you, the biomechanics change. It's not the same thing when you do with a barbell where you have the weight on your neck. Or we could even demonstrate it with the kettlebell. If I have it right here on my shoulder blades, now if I go down, I can actually use the biomechanics of a back squat. Because now the weight is right there in the middle of my foot coming back up. So this is something that you want to understand. And sometimes coaches don't even talk about it. So they have it up here and they even lean forward, which is a beginner mistake, which we're going to talk about in a second. But now let's understand the goblet squat. It's standing a little bit wider than shoulder width apart, even though there's more preference. Now, feet out, pointing my feet out a certain degree, not too wide, just a certain degree. Then I understand now that my toes are pointing out, that my knees follow the toes. So I push them out, I'm coming down. And I always make sure that my back is straight. You see from the side view. Boom. Now, what this requires is a very good mobility in your hip as well as some strong back muscles, because you need a strong back. Because if you don't have a strong back, you maybe start hunching and you're right in front. So always make sure it's chest up, you pull your shoulders back and you come whoop, boom, back up. This is the goblet squat. Now there's a couple of mistakes that beginners may make. The first mistake is, like I've mentioned, using the biomechanics of a back squat with a goblet squat that demands the biomechanics of a front squat. What would that look like? Kettlebells up here, and now applying the biomechanics of a back squat. Now what happens is, I'm exaggerating a little bit, what happens is the weight pulls me down in front of me, right? So you see there's a moment arm. The kettlebell, the weight's probably here. The moment arm goes into my the middle portion of my foot. So this moment arm, this weight, because gravity pulls everything down, has to get compensated by my lower back. I immediately feel it. So if I go down like this, I'm thinking, okay, ooh, that's pretty tough on my back. Yes, because you're using the biomechanics of a back squat. So if we have it like this close, and you can always remember your hips are coming close to your calves. You see? That's different. The weight is now pretty close to the center of mass. Now, no pressure on the lower back, and I can really work my legs. Now, the next beginner mistake that people do is they're hunching. When they manage to go down, they start hunching. Now, if you are resting, I use this position to rest. You can rest. That's not a problem, to really just loosen your back. And then when you go up, you really straighten your chest, straighten your back, and then come back up. Well, what people do is they get tired, and then they come back up like this. The kettlebell moves forward, and this is what happens. Or they move the kettlebell right in front of them, out of the way, instead of keeping it close to their chest. Now, an additional mistake that we can't even classify as a mistake sometimes is that people are pretty tight in their adductors and are weak in their abductors. So they need some more power and they need to get a stretch. That's why I initially mentioned that you need a very good hip mobility, and you can check out this video where you can really loosen your hips up to really get a good mobile hip. And now there is another aspect that we have to talk about, and this is how your hip is structurally played out. If you have a hip that the sockets look pretty straightforward or pretty wide out, laterally looking or medially looking, this can influence how much external rotation your femur is able to reach. What is the angle? So maybe some people say, okay, listen, I'm going down, I can't, it's blocking, okay? So they will never get into this so-called, I call this an Asian squat, right? Because when you see I forgot his name, but it's one of the strongest weightlifters. It's a Chinese guy, I think. He's down in that position, like he's so close and he's so perfect in that position, like when you have the arms extended. Digressing a little bit, this is a so-called Russian extension where they have their arms fully extended. It's crazy. But sometimes maybe your structural integrity does not allow a certain angle, and that's totally fine, and you work with what God has given you. Number 5, the strict press. Now, Mark Rippetoe used to say that back in the days in the powerlifting meets, they were demonstrating their upper body power not with the bench press, but with the overhead press, because an overhead press demonstrates how powerful your upper body is. Now, this is what the strict press is for. Let me show you and demonstrate the strict press. Now, I have to put down my Apple Watch, as I love to show with my right hand. And this is another aspect. If you have something that is right on your wrists, depending on the size, I would always recommend make sure your wrists are free. There's nothing on it, so there's nothing in the way when we now grab the kettlebell. Now, we bring the kettlebell up, and now I'm going to show you a little closer. This is a so-called hook grip. As you can see, the belt, the heavy part, is resting on my forearms. Now, you maybe complained about, wow, I got new makeup on my forearms. I see some colors I've never seen before on my forearms because of the clean. That's another story. And then maybe you feel the pressure because your soft tissues have to adapt. Your skin, ligaments, sinews, and even bones, they're not used to the weight. That's normal. This takes time. Give it some time. It will be better. Now, when you have the kettlebell in the so-called hook grip, as you can see, it's landing neatly and very easy on my palm. Now I can still move my fingers. No pressure in my forearms. it's not burning my forearms. Don't put it up here in a crush grip. This will lead to the fact that your forearms have to do some work, your flexors. This will burn your flexors pretty quickly. This will lead to the fact that you won't be able to press anymore, or whatever you do, you can't work and you put the kettlebell down. So the hook grip, getting really deep in the kettlebell. And always imagine that the lower part of the handle makes contact with your forearm, with the bone of your forearm. So as you can see, it is connected. Now the rack rest position is something else. I make sure that my elbow makes contact with the iliac crest, that's that bony structure of your hip, that they make contact so I can rest. The rest position is the beast by itself. I make sure that my upper body is relaxed. I make sure that my lower body is tense. This is the mental gymnastics that we sometimes talk about. You have to understand how to tense your lower body and how to relax your upper body, half the body. Now strict pressing it, I'll always follow a medial line. Now overhead and the top fixation, I make sure that my thumb points backwards, my biceps close to my ear, and my elbow fully extended. If I put the kettlebell down, I'm using a so-called cue that we call, especially when the weight gets heavier, that comes from Denis Vasilev. We call it shoulders touch. So as you can see, it's like in soccer, when you're trying to pick up a ball with the chest, you really want to put it down and not just drop it or go immediately for your hips, but you want to reach your shoulders first and then drop it into the hip, and make sure you have a lot of power extending your knees, and your quads are burning, your glutes are burning, hamstrings burning, because they have to make sure you're like a spring mechanism. That's not very useful for a strict press, because strict pressing means I use the power of my upper body, but it's very useful and you want to get accustomed to that if you do jerks or push press or whatever have you. Now beginners make the mistake that we already talked about, is they have the kettlebell right here on their palm, so they're burning their forearms. Second mistake is they don't move medially, they go laterally. And there's actually a biomechanical reason why you want to go medially and make sure that the thumb points backwards. And that is, your shoulder can freely move without hurting itself or without having a so-called impingement syndrome with some of your muscles up on your shoulder, because you have to imagine the shoulder is very tight. It is the best way to press if your shoulder is externally rotated when it's on top, right? So what happens is, once you got the kettlebell in the rack rest position, your arm is internally rotated. But once you go up, you want to imagine the cue that also comes from Denis Vasilev is handles first. So I don't press the kettlebell up like this. The heavy part is here and the handle is here, because that means it's heavier for my shoulder. What I want to do is I want to externally rotate my arm to press the handle up first. And once I'm on top, this is what I just mentioned, that Russian way of pressing is really extending the arm, and really I'm overextending even my wrist to really get that feeling. Because most beginners, when you say stretch your arms out or hands up, they do something like this and they think their arms are straight. And I do understand, because they don't have the feeling or the triggering mechanism yet, or the kinesthetic sense. So you want to make sure it's boom, fully extended. Now another mistake, we could call it a mistake, is using a dip or a bump for the press. In a strict press, you want to have everything tight and make sure that your elbow really connects with the iliac crest of your hip when you press it in, so you can use some power and some compact force from your lats. Always make sure that the arm is really tense and ready to deliver some force. Another mistake that we just quickly touched upon that I want to elaborate a little bit is understanding what the physics are when you press a kettlebell up in the overhead top fixation. Now, this external rotation is so important, not only because it's healthier for the shoulder, but pressing it up like this. As you can see now, the kettlebell is now even with the handle. You can see this? Kettlebell even with the handle. If I press the weight up like this, I have additional and unnecessary torque on my shoulder. Shoulder is a very delicate joint. Be sure you're very careful with that joint. So now I want to say, no, this is not really nice, or it doesn't feel good, or it's not healthy, or it won't allow me to press heavier weights. Is I want to go up like this. Now you can see the handle is coming up and the bell is downwards. Makes it better and not, it makes it easier, but not in the sense of, whoa, that's very easy. I can do now 100 reps if a weight that is really challenging. It's just the better way. Now, another mistake that I even seen coaches teach is to flare your arms out like this and then press it, all right? Even though this could be a valuable option when you do it with a barbell, I don't think with the kettlebell is the right way. Because if I get my arms out like this and now I start pressing, I have immediate tension in my shoulder. I can already feel it because the kettlebell is pulling down behind my shoulder or behind my arm, right? So that means that a really small portion of the rotator cuff muscles have to carry the weight. And when you get tired, this can cause some problems. Number 6 is the windmill. It's a very tricky one. The windmill is tricky. However, it's a great, I would say, a full body exercise. It stabilizes your shoulder and works your torso, but also works your legs. So that's the beauty of kettlebell training. You almost every time when you do these basics, integrate your whole body as a unit. Now, what does it look like? Man, my right arm is now tired after showing you that strict press. Now, coming up, now what I want to do is, don't make it very complicated. What you say is, you can either point your toes forward or point them to the side. Now, you need good shoulder mobility for this exercise, and make sure you really understand the hook grip. If you don't understand the hook grip, your forearms are already burning, right? So, what you want to do is the easier version now with toes pointing out. We always call it the so-called Instagram pose. All right, ladies, you know what I'm saying. You know what I'm talking about, right? The Instagram pose is you push your hips out. All right. Now my upper body starts to react naturally because the hip leads the body. Okay. Now my upper body leans down. I'm connecting. You don't have to connect, but I'll just love to do it. I connect with my free arm, connecting to my right leg. Now going down. Now, if you don't have as much of a flexibility in your hamstrings, you can bend your knees a little bit. That's totally fine. If you're a little bit better, you can keep it more in a loose position, unlocked. And now you come up, and that's it. Coming back down. Back up. This is the windmill. Even the easier version, if you're just starting out, is switching hands. Now, got the kettlebell in my right hand. Now, understanding first the mechanics is pushing hips back, arms up, coming down. And what I just naturally do is when there are some shearing forces in the spine or some twisting forces, what I love to do is just use the Valsalva breathing method. And Pavel Tsatsouline calls it breathing behind the shield. So that's like keeping really a tight abdomen, keeping it really tight. And then you release the air when you're on top. Again, just as a side note when it comes to breathing. Just a small segue into breathing. I think it's important for you to use the so-called, we call it the power breathing, using a lot of force to use your lungs and your diaphragm like a pump to get the used air out and new air in, which is very useful. And then you can really choose where you want to breathe, because in our live workouts, sometimes I'm breathing so heavily. Just for example, with the windmill, it could be that I'm here. It's just a matter of preference and a matter of how much air you really need. Now, beginner mistake with the windmill, just if your shoulder's not mobile, don't use too much heavy weight or use the easy version first, because you want to get that vibe of the so-called Instagram pose. I know, guys, we're not used to doing stuff like this. I know, most of us at least, I think, but it's totally fine. It's just a matter of understanding and learning, because it starts again in the hip. So make sure there are many mistakes that you can do, and you want to avoid that the kettlebell drops or it pulls you back because it's too heavy for you to manage. Make sure you start with the easy version, the one that I showed the second. Start with this one first, and then you gradually work your way up. You can just even work with your arm or work with a very light weight just to get that feeling, right? And make sure when you lean down, you don't have to lean down too much or lose your center of mass. Always make sure that the kettlebell is stabilized right in the middle of your body, right here. If I go down now from the top to the bottom, I'm still in my center of mass. Now the windmill is that one exercise that I don't often recommend to do because it can be so tricky on your shoulder, especially most of us are so tight in the shoulder, and most of us are also tight in the hip joint, but the shoulder is very delicate in comparison to the hip joint. The hip joint can take a little brunt, it's easy, but the shoulder is very tricky. So be careful with the windmill if you try for the first time. Now, one of the favorites, number 7, and then we got this whole category, the so-called grinding lifts completed, and then we jump into the ballistics. Now the Turkish Get Up is a beast. You've probably heard about it. Now, I just recently read the book, I'm just skimming through the book of Pavel Tsatulin's Simple and Sinister, and he just calls it the Get Up. I don't know why. Because Turkish Get Up means it has some Oriental background from Turkey. So the Turkish folks, there is a so-called oil ringing, okay? So oil wrestling. And this move is to understand the Get Up, the Turkish Get Up is there to, it used to be in the fight zone when you lay on the ground and you want to get up as quick as possible and push your opponent back. And this, as history says it, or as far as I have heard some tales and stories, it originated in Turkey with the Turkish oil wrestling. Now, we want to start from the top. Bring the kettlebell up. Now, putting it, always make sure the hook grip, guys, so important. I put it up. Now, it's a combination of almost all the exercises that we have just done. The first thing is an overhead lunge. Now the kettlebell's overhead. Now I'm putting down my right knee, all right? My right knee, I put it down on the floor like we just talked about in the reverse lunge. Now my right arm has to make contact with the floor. So what do? I don't lean back, I just go sideways because it's the fastest way. I see sometimes, it's a beginner mistake that we can already talk about, folks are leaning back. You don't have to do this. Go sideways. Now your right leg has to pass your left leg beneath. Straighten it, put it on the heels. Now put your hips down and then you slide down. I always slide because I want to connect with the elbow first, and then from the elbow going down on my back, and now bringing the kettlebell down. This is where you get a full rest. And sometimes when the weight gets heavy, I'll sometimes push it over here just to not feel, so I can breathe better, because the kettlebell is here right on my lung and sometimes makes it hard to breathe. Now we're coming back up. I'm pressing the kettlebell up. Now this is a great chest exercise. Now, how can I get up from this position? I have to transfer my whole body, the whole weight onto my right elbow. That is, the arm is straightened on the floor. Now, right elbow, and I use my left foot, shifting the weight on my right elbow, and now I'm on the elbow, right? So I can sit up. I need to use some power for my arm. Now, I'm really pulling my arm pretty neat and tight into close to my back. Now, hips come up. Now, this is important. When you pull your knees in, don't do it like this. This is another beginner mistake. You have to understand, it's not just pulling your knee in, it's also starting to switch and move your hip. You see that? Exaggerate a little bit for you to see it, but the hip has to move with it. Not just going back like this and thinking, okay, nothing's working. Just whoop, boom, hip moves with your body. Now I'm leveling my body to really look straight. Now it's an overhead lunge, coming back again. And here you go. And the same thing from the other side. Now what I want to show you is when you start from the bottom, you want to make sure you use the so-called, the first position is the embryo position, right? Was a baby in the womb. Because you don't want to start like this. You know why? External rotation, pulling the kettlebell up like this, can be tricky. So what we want to do is, I want to hug the kettlebell and say that I love her. Say that I think about her so much. Say that I really, oh, baby, oh, you're so awesome. That's an additional, an optional step. And then you pull the kettlebell close to your body. This is important, close to your chest. And now with the power of your left arm that is really now grabbing the kettlebell, you can safely get on your back. And then making your way up again. And if you have enough of a mobility, sometimes I don't even have to really twist my hip. I can just really almost don't have to move my hip as much. I can work like this and come back up. You see, there's always a little room if you're a little bit of advanced, if you're advanced in your training, and also understand that maybe sometimes if you have different limbs, if your anthropometrics are different, then maybe the exercise looks a little different. But as long as you follow the right protocols, you're totally fine. Now, we already talked about the beginner mistakes, and one of the beginner mistakes that most people do with the Turkish Get Up is they're confused with those different movements. So if you're confused, this means your brain has to use additional power to think, so that means your muscles don't get enough power or don't have enough blood in them. So always make sure you want to go through the steps without no kettlebell at all. You don't have to push yourself. Even if you join us in one of our live workouts and you see Angel and me going nuts with the Turkish Get Up, don't go crazy. You can say, okay, I'll let the dude yell, I'll let the girl yell. They're crazy, so I'm not crazy, but maybe I'll become crazy. You just start moving easy, getting the vibe. Getting the vibe. Okay, now this feels good. Because even without weight, your arm will feel like, okay, now it's dropping, it's dropping. You gotta keep it close, gotta keep it close. And think about it, okay, the Russian extension, like the Russians, do it like the Russians do it. Don't go too far back, go sideways, all right, that's good. Now, feet on toes, left foot on toes, that's right. Now I'm dropping down, I gotta think, okay, now on my elbows first, because I don't wanna drop like this, because with weight it's gonna be tricky. And when I put the kettlebell down, I always have to make sure, because I don't wanna call the dentist, it's coming down here. And don't switch it up on the sides. Another one that I can show you is when you wanna switch the kettlebell, right? And now you're done. Don't switch it over your body. This can be dangerous or tricky. You can just put it down, or you go back up and switch it on top is also a valuable option. Or just like I did, just put it down and then you switch your body and then you start again, okay? So as you can see, there's so many safety protocols involved in the training because you don't want to hurt yourself, especially when you get the passion and the vibe for kettlebells and you hurt yourself and you're out of the game for a long time. This can be tricky. Now let's dive into the ballistics. I love the ballistics. We believe there's 3 exercises that you can do. Exercise number 8 is the swing. Now we do the Russian style, the Gregory sport style. So it's not snapping the hips, it's not using all of your force that's available, and then after 10 reps you're burned out and you have to put the kettlebell down. We think about the kettlebell sport style is working with the weight continuously and having fun with it, working according to the law of exercise. Now, the swing has 5 phases. We're gonna go over them very briefly. The first phase is, and it's not the first phase actually, this is phase 0. Now why is this phase 0, or why do we involve a phase that's called 0? Because I believe you start like this when you start any ballistic movement. Whether this is a swing, whether this is a clean, or whether this is a snatch. Okay, you always start in the hinge ready phase. Now phase number 1 for the swing is the backswing. And make sure, now the difference is you grab the kettlebell in a so-called finger grip. Not in the hook grip now, or not in a crush grip, we got it in the finger grip. Now you have to understand we're always switching between finger, like this, and hook grip. Especially when we talk about the clean. Now, Phase one, pulling the kettlebell in, boom, back swing. And now, even with the orientation of the wrist, its preference, I've gotten used to internally rotate my arm, so that means it's a back grip. And what this does is just relaxes your arm a little bit more, so that means you can work maybe with heavier weight, but it's preference. Now, pulling it back, backswing, hip extension, boom. Very important when you do the hip extension, make sure that your arm stays close to your body. And when the hip extension is fulfilled, boom, muscles contracted. This means, bam, you're now transferring the power that came from your posterior chain into your arm, because your arms have to be loose. Bam. Now the kettlebell's up here. Make sure your fingers are pointing down. And we always do the so-called hand-to-hand swing because we believe it's the best version. Now, pointing the kettlebell down means the bell looks towards the floor and the handle looks towards me. This will avoid any momentum in the wrist. Switching hand over. Now, that's the most important phase number 4, that beginners have to master. Kettlebell drops, letting gravity do its thing, reconnecting to my body, and now, boom, final phase, going into the backswing. And I love what Steve Cotter taught me. He said, there's one very specific cue that you want to memorize. It's called maximize the time the arm is connected to your body and minimize the time the arm is disconnected to your body. Now, what does the swing look like? It's easy stuff. Ooh, now I remember it. I can't even remember the last time I did a swing with a 16. Now I'm really working with 24s and 28s and 32s. But it just feels awesome. And as you can see, my upper body doesn't have to lean forward as much. I'm just relaxing my upper body, going into my natural kyphosis. This is totally fine. Hip takes the brunt of the weight, and make sure you go into this pendulum. So beginners make the mistake that they start like this, wasting their first rep. Another mistake that beginners make is they're scared of gravity. So once the kettlebell drops, they pull their hips back too early because they're scared, and that's instinct. If something heavy falls between your legs, we instinctively pull the hips back. It's normal. We have to override that instinct. Now, another beginner's mistake is when they use the hip extension, they use their arms first. Okay? Now, if I use my arms first, I can use as much hip extension as I like. I'm still burning my arms. So relaxing and loosing the arm. Another mistake the beginners make is they don't follow the so-called medial line. Because if you don't follow the medial line and you go outside that line, maybe your kettlebell makes friends with your knee joints or your kneecaps, and you want to avoid it. So if you're scared of this, you want to stand maybe a little bit more shoulder width apart, and then you're safe, and then you're slowly, gradually going closer and always following that medial line. This medial line, you have to remember it once you go to the next exercise. Another beginner mistake is that people start leaning towards the floor. And this is another instinct that we try to override, because remember, think about this. If you put something down, if you have something heavy in your hand, first of all, we have instinct, we want to move everything with your arm. So that's why we have to become loose. Second instinct, something heavy drops between my legs, want to pull it back, have to override it, don't have to be scared. And now the third instinct is, if we have something in our arm and we put it down, what happens? Or something goes down, what happens? The upper body bends towards the floor and the hips go back. That's another instinct that you want to override, because you don't want to go into whoop as far down, or you maybe get a little dizzy. It's totally fine if you're just really hinging a little bit in the hip, then losing hip extension, and there you go. And today we just found out a very cool drill that you can do. We actually found out with a client that and she's 70 plus, and we did the swing with her today, which was cool. Now, try, just to get the feeling and the vibe, try this motion. Loosening up your arms. connecting your arm to your body. Then hip flexing, hip extending, flexing, extending. And get that loose vibe, that easy vibe, so you can work with the kettlebell as efficiently and as long as possible. Now the last exercise is the clean and jerk. Now the clean and jerk, you always have to imagine, if we go up the ladder, the swing, bottom, clean, level 2, snatch, level 3, because everything starts with the swing. So I have to understand the mechanics of the swing if I want to go in a clean, and if I want to go in a snatch, all right? Just understanding the swing, getting it down pat, is one of the most important ways, or one of the best ways to really manage the clean and jerk, and even now, then the snatch. The snatch is a beast. Now the clean and jerk. And what we do is backswing, couple of phases, many phases actually. Let's go to them one by one with the kettlebell. Now, same thing, phase 0, hinge ready. Pulling the kettlebell backswing. Now the difference starts right here. Coming forward with a so-called low swing, right? Inertia phase, just easy. Not using the full hip extension from the swing, just easy. Now the kettlebell travels forward. Acceleration pull, because I want to move the kettlebell outside of the horizontal into the vertical plane. So I have to pull, be easy, be smooth. And here's very important that we always point the fingers down, because that's another mistake in the swing, when you really flip your wrist and you have additional torque in the wrist, which can be tricky for your hands, and it's not really a cool feeling. So coming up, whoop, fingers point down. Now the hand insertion, switching from the finger grip into the hook grip, bam, and then rack resting the kettlebell in the so-called rack rest position. Now going into the jerk, we're using the legs like a spring mechanism, upper body is relaxed. Now we go into the dip, loading the spring, going into the bump, jumping up, using the power of our hips, resting the arm on our hips, boom. Now the arm comes up. Now I want to straighten my elbow simultaneously as my knees are flexing or bending. It's a double dip. Dropping to make it easier to catch the weight. Back up and over at top fixation. First amortization, dropping the kettlebell, boom. Second amortization into the backswing and then back up, all right? So it looks a little something like this. Now, using your legs and powering through. Russian style, extending your arms. Dropping the kettlebell, and like we talked about in the strict press, shoulders touch, and then you go back into your hip. And then when you drop the kettlebell, this is something that you're going to learn when you talk about the snatch. Use gravity and use physics. Don't just drop the kettlebell forward, because remember, it's the instinct that you want to lean forward when you drop something to the floor. No, you want to drop the kettlebell and then lean back. You see how easy that was? Because I'm leaning back, I'm letting the kettlebell drop, it reconnects, and gravity does its thing, and I'm compensating gravity. So I can heavily focus on the hand insertion. Couple of mistakes that beginners make is they use the crush grip when they're grabbing the kettlebell. If you have mistakes, beginner mistakes in the swing, and you start the clean or even the snatch, these mistakes will transfer into the clean, so make sure that your swing is down pat. Now, another mistake, pulling the kettlebell up, using too much force, or going way outside. And what Steve taught me is, imagine you have a brick wall or a glass wall in front of you, so you don't want to hit that glass wall like this, boom, and then pulling it up. It's closer to your body. And that goes back to the cue that says maximize the time the arm's connected to your body and minimize the time the arm's disconnected to the body. That means pulling the kettlebell up. Now, I don't have a lot of distance between elbow and iliac crest of my hip, so I can just boom, pull it in, and I'm safe. Now, this mistake, probably everybody knows it. Forearm. Why is the kettlebell crashing on your forearm? It's because you are not using a proper hand insertion, and maybe your wrist starts flipping. So if I start flipping my wrist like this, I have to use the front grip. You see how it slams? Maybe not on my forearm, but on my shoulder. And now I have this crush grip again. So it's not flipping the kettlebell. I can show you with the 8 kilo. It's not about, okay, here. It's not this, because this is gonna hurt. It is pulling the kettlebell, pulling it in the finger grip, and then sliding in the hook grip, and then pulling it in. That's the acceleration pull combined with the hand insertion. So you see, if I let it loose, you see how my fingers are pointing down? So that means my pinky is always connected, but my what's the finger? The index finger, right? The index finger loses some contact. And now I can just, you see? Spearing the kettlebell. So it's smooth, and that takes practice and some time, but you will get there. Now, when we keep going, in the jerk, people are bending their knees. They don't understand what the rack rest position is, so you have to keep your legs locked. That's a lot of power. So when I do the live workouts, I feel the most, I get fatigued in my legs now, not in my upper body, my legs, because they're loaded like a spring, so I'm ready. Now make sure, if we look at biomechanics here, the weight goes down in front of your hip, in front of your knees. That's safe for your lower back. If you're up here leaning back, the weight goes down behind my hip, behind my knees, dangerous for the lower back, injury risk. So this needs some mobility in the shoulder so I can really connect with the iliac crest of my hip, really pulling it down. You see? It's not up here, it's down here. Now I'm ready. And upper body's relaxed. People always think you have to be tight. No, it's not a deadlift. It is a rack rest position. So kyphosis, natural kyphosis, and I'm ready. Now, another mistake that people make is they use the dip, but when they go into the bump, the arms are already disconnected. So it's the same thing as with the swing. If the arm's disconnected, then the dip and the bump, the power that you get from your legs, that fire that's coming from below you, is not adding fuel, or you're not adding fuel to the fire because you're not connected anymore. So make sure you stay connected until the bump is finished. Now the double dip, this one, this takes a lot of time. The jerk takes time. Practice it. Okay? I feel that I have to work on my double dip. I really have to work on it because it takes time. And it's not about slamming your heels. It's about dropping so you can relax. And then once you go up, you relax again. This is, you see, that's the mental gymnastics. And now I have tension up here so that the kettlebell stays close. Another mistake is the kettlebell goes far too out laterally. You gotta stay in your center of mass. Dropping it, shoulders touch. Now people, boom, have a problem with the drop. And then like we mentioned in the strict press, when they come up, it's handles first. And then when you drop the kettlebell, it's not leaning forward and up, and now disconnecting your arm from your body, it's leaning back. It's science, I know. Woo! Now, let's talk about the snatch. Guys, the snatch, let me tell you, the snatch takes ages to learn in the good boy sport style. That's probably the reason why you don't see that style that often, because you need a very good coach to teach you the ins and outs of the good boy sport snatch. And it's ballet. It's the Swan Lake of kettlebell training. That's what we call it. Now, it has 9 phases. Now we can really discuss the phases because other coaches put different names on it or different phases. I took most of the phases from Denis Vasilev, but I also incorporated some of my own because it helped our students, our clients and beginners to really understand what the snatch is all about. Now, it's all about working now from the down position, all right, from the backswing right into the overhead top fixation. So 9 phases. It's backswing, it's hip acceleration, the arm starts flying. Now, somewhere up in between is the acceleration pull, which happens in the clean up here. So it's up there. Now, really spearing the kettlebell, hand insertion, then overhead top fixation. And even in that overhead top fixation, when you listen to Dennis Vasilev, he says, you really gotta, once the kettlebell comes up, you gotta really put a stop to it. Because if you don't put a stop to it, it'll flare your arms over and maybe hurt your shoulder. So it's up here, boom, make sure that your thumbs are pointing backwards so that your shoulder is externally rotated. Now, overhead top fixation. Now here comes the tricky part when you go into the amortization. We call it corkscrew, okay, because I'm using my wrist to drop the kettlebell and then I'm leaning back. It's not flipping, it's leaning back, corkscrew, leaning back. Now leaning back to the fullest, kettlebell drops, amortization. Now I'm reconnecting and going into the backswing. These are the 9 phases and it's pretty complex. We have another video up here that you can check out if you want to take a look at it in more detail. Now, I'm always using the back grip, so make sure you use the front. I'm gonna use the front grip. Overhead top fixation, you see that? Now coming down. Now what happens with the snatch, which is so tricky to understand, is you work with gravity. Let me show you with the Aikido. You work with gravity. It's about leaning back. And when you lean back, you start compensating for the drop, right? Because if I don't lean back, what happens? This happens again, right? It's about, well, I'm falling towards the floor. So I gotta override the instinct that we have to override in the swing. That's why it's so important to master the swing. Boom, you see? Kettlebell drops. Boom. And I'm pushing my hips forward like I do in the swing, pushing the hips forward to reconnect with my arm as fast as possible. And then, boom, going to the backswing. Now, when I go into the backswing, you really want to almost extend your legs to the fullest. And what I sometimes do is I have one part of my leg bent a little bit. And then once you come back up, you see I'm using my hip like an aim. So my right foot, if I'm snatching with my right arm, my right foot is like the aim. So I'm tilting towards the hip, tilting it upwards. So I'm really pushing it. And the other side, if I'm snatching with my right arm, my left leg does the most work because I come down and now you see that? It's that motion coming down and boom. And once I'm up here, this takes an eternity to master the hand insertion, to really get that smooth that it feels nice and good. And then when we drop, kettlebell drops, pushing the hips forward. And now what I do is I'm lifting my right toe up when I'm snatching with my right arm and I'm reconnecting. Whoa, coming back up. And now I sometimes even start it when I'm swinging with heavier weights. I'm just using that drill a little bit to get the flow. I'm looking like Michael Jackson, right? I'm calling myself the king of the swing. That's what's up. That's the vibe, guys. That's the vibe. So I'm just floating like a butterfly, like Muhammad Ali. Man, I can't keep going like this. Now this is just a understand. Oh, this was a bad one, actually. See? And that's good for you to understand, for you to see. Now take a look at where my arm is. That's great that it happened. You see? Now if I'm up here, feeling tension in my forearm. And now I can't even really grab it, so that's tricky if I'm up here. And now even the drop is getting tricky because I can't really, it's hard for me to grip it because if I go fast, then it drops really fast. So it's using my upper body to work with gravity, to compensate for the gravitational pull that always happens when you work with weights. And that's the beauty of the snatch. And that overhead hand insertion takes a long time. It takes a long time to understand, okay, I gotta isolate now the legs from each other, right? Gotta isolate it, what? So, I gotta isolate the legs, work independently with my upper body. That's the nuance of the snatch. It's the last exercise that you're gonna learn because it takes so much patience, so much time, and you have to master the swing and the clean and jerk first. Now, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, if this video was not only worth your time, but also worth your money, consider joining the Kettlebell Club, because we stream 3 times per week now, as of now, with our live workouts. And we have started a so-called Kettlebell Club. The Kettlebell Club gets some awesome perks, some nice emojis, a private Facebook group, and even the LS logo right next to their name. It costs you $5.95 per month, and if you want to join the club, we have a very welcoming community. You can click the link in the description. And if you like the video and subscribe to the channel, that's also very, very cool. Catch you on the next one. Peace out. Cut. Are we done? We're done? All right. Huh? Yeah, listen, I was thinking about it. If the kettlebell, if you really want to smuggle cocaine, right? You have that, you see that, you gotta see it. I'm gonna show it because you can actually put some cocaine on the handle, because then the handle is white, right? And you can say it's chalk, but you can actually smuggle it like this. Isn't that great? Man, that's a great idea, man.